Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Edward, obviously, and I'm your lecture instructor for Bio 169. So I wanted to do some virtual lectures on the material that we will be covering this semester. I always find it helpful to provide instruction over the material that we're learning, but I also would like to give my own personal lecture for you all because I'm your instructor, and I feel that you should be able to hear me teach the material to help you understand it. Let me actually raise this so it doesn't look like I'm looking down on you all. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share my computer and we're just going to go through the lecture as if we were in class. Let's see, here we go. Show all my windows. Hold on one second. I am not seeing the PowerPoint. Give me one moment. Okay, so we are going to start with chapter 16. That's the first chapter that we cover in Bio 169, and it is going to be of the endocrine system. So we're going to just navigate the PowerPoint as if we were in class, and then there are certain areas that I'm going to skip over just so that this video is not too long, and I'll let you know what those are. So the endocrine system is going to explain to us how our body is going to govern long-term processes of growth and development. And if you remember back, close out my Outlook so you don't keep getting notifications. If you remember back from 168, we discussed the nervous system and we talked about how the nervous system is going to help govern our body's immediate and quick responses to changes that occur internally and externally. Well, the endocrine system is going to govern our more long-term processes. So the endocrine system acts with the nervous system to coordinate and integrate the activity of our body cells. It's going to influence metabolic activities through the use of hormones. So hormones are the chemical messengers for this system, just like neurotransmitters were the chemical messengers for the nervous system. Although responses with hormones are going to be slower than versus responses from neurotransmitters and nerve impulses, these responses are going to last longer in the body compared to responses that occur from the nervous system. Endocrinology is going to be the study of hormones and those organs that are associated with this system. Table 16.1 gives us a really nice overview of the differences between these two systems. And I'm not going to ask you specific test questions about how the nervous system varies from the endocrine system, but it is good to look at the two just to see how they differ. So specifically, this system is going to govern processes of reproduction, growth and development, maintenance of water, electrolytes, and our nutrient balance in our blood. It's going to help to regulate cell metabolism and energy balance, and it's also going to control the mobilization of body defenses, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the lymphatic system. If you remember from Bio 168, we talked about two types of glands. We have exocrine glands, and remember that those glands are going to excrete their products onto an epithelial surface, and those products are going to travel through a duct to get to an epithelial surface. Endocrine glands, which are the ones that we're going to talk about with this particular body system, they are going to excrete their products directly into blood, and they don't need a duct. And the common product that will be excreted from these glands are going to be hormones. So the endocrine glands that we will talk about most commonly with this chapter will be the pituitary gland, thyroid, parathyroid, the adrenal gland, and the pineal glands. The hypothalamus is considered a neuroendocrine organ because we find the hypothalamus within the brain, so it's associated with the nervous system, but it also plays a vital role in this particular system as well. So that's why it is referred to as a neuroendocrine organ. We have other organs in our body that are not primarily endocrine organs, but because they produce hormones, they are associated with this particular system. And so we'll discuss those organs and tissues and the hormones that they excrete and how they affect the body. So here we have a diagram, figure 16.1, that shows us the location of the common organs that we will talk about with this system and where we find them. And I would definitely say take a look at this diagram, make sure that you are familiar with where we find these organs because you're going to need to know them and identify them for lab. Okay, so getting into the endocrine system more specifically and talking more about hormones, we can classify the chemical messengers associated with this system. So our primary chemical messenger will be hormones. These are the chemical messengers that are going to act over a long distance, and they're going to travel through our blood and our lymph. So when we say that they act over long distances, we could have a hormone being released from the brain that is eventually going to send a particular hormone to the reproductive system. Autocrines are chemical messengers that are associated with this system, and they are chemicals that will exert an effect on the same cell that secretes them. So if you are an autocrine, you are going to excrete out a chemical, and then that chemical will have an effect on you. Auto, self, crine. If you are a paracrine, you are a chemical that will act locally to affect cells that are surrounding you. So I'm a paracrine chemical, so I'm a cell that's going to excrete out this chemical, and then that chemical will have an effect on surrounding cells. So it won't have an effect on me, but it will have an effect on surrounding cells. Autocrines and paracrines are local chemical messengers, but they are not considered necessarily a part of the endocrine system because they are not hormones. But they, depending on who you're talking to, they might be considered to be associated with the system, just not a part of it. Okay, we can classify hormones based on their composition. So we have hormones that have an amino acid base, and so we consider peptides, proteins, and some amino acid derivatives in terms of their composition of hormones under this classification. And then if you are a hormone that is synthesized from cholesterol, you're going to be classified as a steroid hormone. And examples of these are going to be the hormones that we find within our gonads, and then the hormones that we find within the adrenal cortex, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. A possible third classification of hormones can be our eicosanoids. And there's some controversy with that because these classification of hormones are considered hormones by some scientists, but then some scientists classify eicosanoids as a paracrine. So depending on what scientist you're talking about, it varies. But the two main classifications will be amino acid-based hormones and steroid hormones. Moving into how hormones communicate. So we're going to release hormones into the blood, then they will travel to particular cells. But how do these hormones know what cells to go to? And that leads us into target cells. So target cells are going to be cells that have a specific receptor for a hormone. And so when the hormone is traveling through our blood, the hormone knows that, okay, this is the cell that I should be going to because I am able to recognize that there's a target cell for me to bind to. When a hormone binds to a target cell, it can produce a chain of reactions and a plethora of those reactions as well. So a hormone can act on a target cell by altering the plasma membrane's ability to allow for things to permeate and cross the plasma membrane. And it can do so by opening and closing ion channels. The hormone can cause the cell to synthesize enzymes or the proteins. We can cause the activation or deactivation of enzymes. We can induce a secretion. We can stimulate mitosis. So there could be a variance of reactions that can occur within a cell or to a cell when a hormone binds to its receptor. Depending on your classification, so if you are an amino acid-based hormone or a steroid hormone, we can kind of further classify you as a water-based hormone. So the majority of our amino acid-based hormones are going to be water-based hormones. The exception to this will be a thyroid hormone. If you are a steroid hormone or a thyroid hormone, then we say you are a water-based hormone, a lipid-based hormone. Now, depending on if you are a lipid-based hormone or a water-based hormone will determine how you communicate with the cell. And so we get into second messenger systems and then intracellular communication. So if you are an amino acid-based hormone, which essentially means you are a water-based hormone, or you like to interact with water-based components, you are going to interact with the cell through what we call second messenger systems. And what we mean by this is, let's take it back to AMP1, Bio 168. Remember, if a substance was water-based and it was trying to cross through the cell membrane, it would not be able to do so because of what? Those hydrophobic tails that make up the plasma membrane. So if you are an amino acid-based hormone, a water-based hormone, you are not going to be able to readily cross the cell membrane and get into the cell to cause a response. So what you're going to do is you're going to communicate through what we call a second messenger system. So we have two main second messenger systems, cyclic AMP and then PIP to calcium. For each one of these processes, I'm not going to test you on the actual order of events, so you don't need to study these two processes that way. I just want you to have an overview of an understanding of these are the two processes that are used to allow for amino acid-based hormones to communicate and cause a response within a cell, and have a general understanding of them. So with cyclic AMP, our initial hormone is what we call our first messenger, and it will bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell, and I'm going to blow this up so that you can see this. So our hormone first messenger will bind to this receptor here that's located in the plasma membrane, because remember, because we're amino acid based, we cannot readily diffuse through the cell membrane here. When hormone or the first messenger binds to the receptor, it's going to cause this G protein to be activated. We're going to activate this G protein. We're going to activate this G protein, and when that occurs, the activation of this G protein here will cause the molecule ATP to be converted into cyclic AMP, which is our second messenger product. Once we activate cyclic AMP, oh, and I forgot one more step. When the G protein is activated, it's going to cause the activation of adenylate cyclase, which is this protein that we see here. And then adenylate cyclase is going to assist in the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. So when we form our second messenger, cyclic AMP, we can have a variation of responses. We can inactivate a protein kinase. If we decide to activate a protein kinase, then we can cause another chain of events to occur within the cell that is desired. So this is the overall process of cyclic AMP second messenger system when dealing with a water-based hormone or an amino acid-based hormone. With PIP2 calcium, this particular type of second messenger system is going to follow a similar pathway, and I don't have a diagram for that, but it is obviously a little different because the name is different. So we're going to have a hormone bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane. So we have our first messenger, which is our hormone, binds to the receptor on the plasma membrane. We're going to activate a G protein, but once we activated the G protein, we're going to activate a different effector enzyme called phospholipase C. The activated phospholipase C will split the membrane protein, the PIP2, into two second messengers that we see here. Then the calcium ions that we find within the cell will act as another second messenger, and the calcium can alter the enzyme activity in channels. And then the activated channels and proteins can amplify a cell response. So like I said before, I don't want you to memorize these two processes like step by step. I'm not going to ask you detailed questions about the steps, but I do want you to have an overall understanding of what the two processes are and why we need them. We need them because our initial hormone, the first messenger, is not able to diffuse directly into the cell to cause a chain of reaction. So we need this second messenger system to allow for the proper response to occur within the cell. Now, excuse me, get my hand sanitizer. If you are a steroid-based hormone, we know that steroid-based hormones fall in the classification of lipid-based hormones. And from what we learned in Bio 168, if I am a lipid-based molecule and I'm small enough, I can readily diffuse across the cell membrane and get into the cell. And so our lipid-based steroid hormones and thyroid hormones are able to do that. And their target or their receptors are actually going to be internal instead of being external, like the amino acid-based amino acid-based hormones. So typically with steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, the receptors are going to be found on the nucleus so that the hormones can actually diffuse across the nuclear membrane and get inside of the nucleus to have a direct effect on DNA. In a lot of cases for steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, the response is going to involve transcribing DNA to form a type of protein that is needed. So we look at this diagram here and we see that our steroid hormone is located here. So because we're a steroid hormone, we're going to be able to diffuse directly across the cell membrane and bind to the receptor protein that this hormone will fit to. Once we make our receptor hormone complex, that then will diffuse through the nuclear pore of the nucleus and bind directly to DNA so that we can start the process of transcription, copying DNA to make messenger RNA. So here we find transcription occurring. We've made our messenger RNA. Now our messenger RNA will exit through the nuclear pore into the cytoplasm so that we can conduct translation and form a protein. So with steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, we are able to cause a response. That hormone is able to cause a response within the cell, and we call this process direct gene activation because the initial hormone is able to directly have an effect on DNA because it's able to diffuse across the cell membrane because it is lipid-based. Here's the animation that I'm just going to skip over for time purposes, but I definitely would encourage you to go back and watch it to further understand the second messenger cyclic AMP process. Okay, so hormone release. This section is going to talk about how we release hormones, how the body knows when to release hormones and then when to stop releasing them. And that's going to be controlled through negative feedback mechanisms. So remember, we learned from 168 that negative feedback responses will occur when an initial stimulus is going to be negated by the effects of the effector in the body. So a stimulus causes our body temperature to increase. So the effector in our body, which would be sweat glands, is going to cause our body temperature to decrease back to normal. The same mechanisms will control hormone release and activation. So hormone release is going to be triggered by an endocrine gland stimulus or a nervous system modulation, and we'll talk about the two. So endocrine glands can be stimulated to synthesize and release their hormones in one of three ways. Humoral stimuli are going to involve changes in blood levels of ions and nutrition. remember that this term is always going to apply or imply a change that is going to occur in bodily fluids. So for example, if our blood is experiencing declining concentrations of calcium, calcium is an ion that's found within our blood, then that's going to trigger the parathyroid glands to secrete the parathyroid hormone. And then the parathyroid hormone will have effects on the skeletal system and our intestines to release more calcium into our blood to bring those calcium levels back to normal. And here we have an example of our parathyroid glands located on the posterior side of the thyroid hormone, the thyroid gland, and excreting out that parathyroid hormone. With a neural stimulus, that's going to involve nerve fibers that will stimulate hormone release. So an example of that is going to be the sympathetic nervous system fibers that will stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete out epinephrine and norepinephrine. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And here we have the diagram showing the spinal cord and then sending a nerve impulse to the adrenal medulla so that we can release those hormones into the blood to initiate an adrenaline rush. And then lastly, a hormonal response is going to occur when one hormone will stimulate other organs to release their hormones. So for instance, I think of the luteinizing hormone and how the anterior pituitary gland is stimulated to release that. So the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called the luteinizing releasing hormone that will go to the anterior pituitary gland, and then the anterior pituitary gland will synthesize and release the luteinizing hormone. So with this type of stimulus, we're taking one hormone that will be targeted to an endocrine organ so that it can stimulate and release another hormone. So these are the three mechanisms of endocrine gland stimuli in terms of how the body knows, okay, we need a hormone to be stimulated, to be released, and we're going to stimulate an endocrine organ in one of these three ways to release the hormone. Now, the nervous system can also affect and cause hormones to be released. And when the nervous system comes into play, the nervous system is going to make adjustments to hormone levels when needed. So it can modify the stimulation or the inhibition of endocrine glands. And an example of that could be when we are in a fight or flight situation. So for example, I am walking outside and I see an elephant running toward me, okay? Because I like animals. So I'm outside, I see an elephant running toward me. I have to make a decision, right? Well, at that point, an adrenaline rush is going to kick in. Well, the nervous system is going to override normal endocrine controls because our endocrine glands are going to follow a negative feedback mechanisms on releasing hormones throughout the body. So normally, I don't need to have an excessive amount of glucose. I don't need to have higher blood pressure or blood rushing through my arteries, and I don't need to have an increased respiration, right? But if I am seeing an elephant run full-fledged to me in my direction, I need to have increased respiration because if I decide to run, I need to be able to run, and I need to be able to run fast. So I'm going to increase respiration. My blood vessels are going to dilate so that more blood can flow through my body so I can have more oxygen and nutrients and glucose flowing through my blood so that I can be prepared to fight or flight. So in this example, the nervous system will override normal endocrine organs so that you can participate and respond accordingly. Whereas under a normal circumstance, if I'm just walking down the street, I don't need to have increased respiration, more blood flowing through my arteries, so on and so on. Okay, so target cell specificity. So this section is basically going to discuss how target cells must have specific receptors for a hormone that is going to bind to it. And it also discusses that the target cell will be activated by these hormones based on three factors. So number one, if our blood has a high concentration of a particular hormone, that hormone is going to cause a response to the cells that have the target cell for the hormone, because we've got high levels of this hormone in our blood. Number two, if a target cell has a lot of receptors for a hormone, that's going to cause a greater response of that hormone on that cell compared to a cell that maybe only has one or two receptors for it. And then lastly, the affinity or the strength of binding between the receptor and the hormone will also determine the response of that hormone on the cell. So if there's a good affinity, a good binding of that hormone to its receptor, then it's going to cause a greater response, versus if the receptor and hormone kind of have a weak interaction or binding relationship. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this section of the amount of influence a hormone can have on a cell. I'm not going to ask you questions about that, so you can skip over this as well. I'm also not going to discuss the half-life, onset, and duration of hormone activity, or I'm not going to test you on that, so you can skip over this section as well. Okay. All right, interactions of hormones. We will talk about this. There are three types of interactions that hormones can have with each other. So we can have what we call a permissive interaction, where one hormone cannot exert its effect without another hormone being present. So for instance, reproductive hormones need a thyroid hormone first to activate the reproductive hormones. So if for some reason your body could not generate and release thyroid hormones, then our reproductive hormones would not be able to function. So that's what we mean by permissiveness. I think of permissiveness as having to ask permission. So I say, or I think to myself, well, it's almost like the reproductive hormones have to, get permission from the thyroid hormone to be active. Synergism is going to occur when more than one hormone produces the same effect on the target cell, but the effect is amplified. So glucagon and epinephrine both are going to cause the liver to release glucose individually. But when you put them together, we're going to have an amplification of the release of glucose versus the response that they have on their own. And lastly, antagonism is going to occur when one or more hormones oppose the actions of another. So for instance, I like to think of the parathyroid gland or the parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to cause the body to decrease blood calcium levels, but the parathyroid hormone will cause the body to increase blood calcium levels. Alrighty, so let's actually get into some endocrine glands and the hormones that they secrete and how they affect the body. So remember, the hypothalamus is going to be a organ that we find in the brain. It is connected to the pituitary gland through a stalk called the infundibulum. Remember that we call the hypothalamus a neuroendocrine organ because we find it in the nervous system, and it also performs and has activities that relate to the nervous system as well as the endocrine system as well. So the hypothalamus is found in the brain. It's connected to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is going to secrete out at least 8 major hormones, and it has 2 major lobes. So we have the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So here we have part of the brain, and we find our hypothalamus here, or I should say this section right here. We have our hypothalamus here, and here is our infundibulum stalk that is going to connect us to the pituitary gland. The anterior portion, or the anterior lobe, is going to be housed here, and the posterior lobe is going to be housed here. So let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, great. Oh, no, I did miss something. The posterior lobe is technically not an endocrine gland or endocrine type of gland. And the reason why is because the posterior lobe of the anterior pituitary gland does not secrete hormones. So by definition, if I am an endocrine organ, I'm secreting out and synthesizing organs. So let me repeat that. The posterior lobe does not synthesize hormones. So what happens is the hypothalamus is going to have 3 major functions. The first function is that it's going to synthesize and release releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. The second function of the hypothalamus is that it's going to synthesize oxytocin and ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. The third function of the hypothalamus is that it's going to send ADH and oxytocin to the posterior lobe by neural stimulation for storage. So the posterior lobe is going to store ADH and oxytocin, but it does not synthesize those two hormones. And for that reason, technically the posterior lobe is not an endocrine organ. It just stores those two hormones. And then when those two hormones need to be released from the body, it's the hypothalamus that sends out a neural stimuli to the posterior lobe to release those hormones from the posterior lobe. So remember, the posterior lobe is going to store ADH and oxytocin, but it's not going to synthesize the two hormones, and the hypothalamus is going to signal to the posterior lobe when to release them. And here we have a diagram showing this process of the hypothalamus controlling or synthesizing oxytocin and ADH, and then sending it to the posterior lobe for storage. Okay, like I said before, the hypothalamus is also going to synthesize and secrete releasing and inhibiting hormones, and these sets of hormones are going to target the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is going to communicate with the anterior lobe by either releasing hormones and or inhibiting hormones, so that the anterior lobe knows when to synthesize and release the other 8 hormones that it makes. And we'll get into those in just a little bit. I've already talked about the posterior pituitary gland and its storage of ADH and oxytocin, so I'll skip over this one, but I do want to touch on how these hormones affect the body. So oxytocin is going to be the hormone that's going to stimulate uterine contractions, and it's also going to assist in the trigger for milk ejection once a woman has a baby and she is lactating. Both of the processes of uterine contractions and labor and milk ejection are going to be positive feedback mechanisms, because the more a child suckles, the more milk the glands make. Also, the more oxytocin that's released in the body, the stronger the uterine contractions become. Anti-diuretic hormone, or ADH, is going to be a hormone that is going to cause the body to retain water when we are dehydrated. So if we have too high concentrations of ions and not enough water to balance out those concentrations, that's going to trigger ADH to be released. ADH will then target tubules that we find within our kidneys to reabsorb water, so that we can prevent eliminating too much water and becoming further dehydrated and going into a potential state of shock and an organ failure from not having enough water. We can also trigger ADH to be released based on levels of pain, low blood pressure, and certain drugs. Now, ADH can be inhibited by the body if we take and consume diuretics and liquor. So for instance, if you've ever drank liquor before, especially if you had a fun night, you drank maybe a lot of liquor, and you notice that I went to the bathroom and I just kept using the bathroom all night long. Like, there was like no stopper. The reason why is because when we drink alcohol, alcohol inhibits the body from registering ADH. So instead of ADH being released when we start to become a little dehydrated and targeting the tubules of our kidneys to reabsorb water, there's no registration of ADH at all. It's almost as if that hormone is not present in the body at all. So when we go to use the bathroom, we just keep excreting out liquid, water. And if someone drinks in a very excessive amount, especially if they're not giving their bodies any water, that really can lead to severe dehydration, and that person can go into having alcohol poisoning. They can go into shock. There's a lot of detrimental effects that excessive consumption of liquor can have on the body. And one of the major issues is because the body is not able to register ADH and reabsorb and retain water as best as it can. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about ADH. So we will move on. All right. For the homeostatic imbalances, I do want you all to read these and understand them and study them, because there will be some questions on the test about them. But for time purposes, I'm going to just skip over these, but make sure that you do understand each one of these imbalances based on the hormones that we're talking about in this chapter. Okay, moving on to the anterior pituitary gland. So like we said before, this gland is going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. Let me make a correction. The anterior lobe only will secrete out 6 hormones, not 8. I was thinking of the whole pituitary gland. The anterior lobe is going to excrete out 6 hormones, and those 6 hormones are going to be growth hormone, TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, and prolactin. So let's start off with the growth hormone. Growth hormone, when it is released into our bloodstream, it has a direct action on metabolism and an indirect growth promoting actions. So for instance, when growth hormone is going to act directly on metabolism, some of the effects that it has on the cell in the body is that it's going to be it'll have glucose sparing actions that will decrease the rate of cell glucose uptake and metabolism. So it almost has like an anti-insulin effect. It's going to trigger the liver, or it can trigger the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. So if we need extra sugar, we can break down our glycogen storage molecule to release glucose. And it can increase blood levels of fatty acids so that we can use it for fuel and encourage cell protein synthesis. Some of the indirect actions of the growth hormone could be that it will trigger the liver, skeletal muscles, and bone to produce insulin-like growth factors. And these insulin-like growth factors can then stimulate cell uptake of nutrients so that we can synthesize DNA and proteins needed for cell division. And also the formation of collagen and the deposition of calcium and phosphorus into bone matrix. Growth hormone Growth hormone stimulates most cells to enlarge and divide, but major targets are going to be bone and our skeletal muscle. So when I think of the growth hormone, I think of the actual process of growing, because those are the cells that it targets when we are growing and developing. Because we are talking about a hormone that is going to be released from the anterior pituitary gland, we're going to need a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So for the growth hormone, we have the growth hormone releasing hormone, and then we're going to need an inhibiting hormone to shut off this hormone when needed. And so we have the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Alrighty. And like I said, once again, go ahead and study this on your own time so that you are aware of this and you are knowledgeable of this. Here we have a diagram showing us some disorders that occur when we have either too little or too much of growth hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. This is a hormone that is going to stimulate normal development and secretion of our thyroid gland. So this one is pretty simple because it's like thyroid stimulating hormone. It should probably go to the thyroid gland, right? Right. So when we are stimulating the release of TSH, the release will be triggered by a thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. It will target the anterior pituitary gland, and then the anterior pituitary gland will synthesize and release TSH. TSH will then travel to the thyroid gland so that the thyroid gland can release thyroid hormones, and then the thyroid hormones will then travel to all of its target cells. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. So corticosteroids are a collection of steroid hormones that we'll talk about in a little bit. Of course, since we are talking about a hormone that's being released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, we need a releasing hormone for it. So the releasing hormone for ACTH is corticotrophin releasing hormone. And this releasing hormone is highest, the levels of this hormone is highest in the morning. So some internal and external factors that can alter the release of the corticotrophin releasing hormone can include fever, hypoglycemia, and stressors. Gonadotrophins, we collectively use that term to represent FSH and LH. So FSH and LH hormones are going to be secreted by gonadotrophic cells, and FSH directly is going to stimulate the production of gametes. So for females, it's going to stimulate the production of eggs, and in males, sperm. And then LH is going to promote the production of gonadal hormones. So in females, LH is going to help the follicles within our ovaries to develop our eggs, and then it will also trigger ovulation and the release of estrogen and progesterone. And then LH in males is going to stimulate the production of testosterone. For LH and FSH, their releasing hormone is going to be the gonadotrophin releasing hormone. And both of these hormones are not going to be in our blood until we reach preteen years, where we're going to start going into being reproductively adults. Lastly, prolactin is going to stimulate milk production in females. And for males, we're really not sure what prolactin does for males, because males don't have mammary glands to secrete out milk. So as of right now, we're still not sure how it affects males. The releasing hormone, the inhibiting hormone for prolactin is going to be the prolactin inhibiting hormone. And the PAH, or the inhibiting hormone for prolactin, is going to prevent the release of prolactin until needed. So for instance, we're only going to need, as females, prolactin to be active after a baby is born and a mother needs to supply milk for the child. There's no need for prolactin to be activated and causing the mammary glands to make milk when a woman is not needing to feed a child. So for this particular hormone, we kind of focus more on the prolactin inhibiting hormone as a suppressor to this hormone until needed. Increased estrogen levels will help to stimulate the release of prolactin. And this is why when a woman is not pregnant, when a woman is not nursing, we still can feel some effects of it. So for instance, when a woman is preparing for menstruation, she might have breast swelling or breast tenderness, and that's because the increased levels of estrogen that are preparing the body for potential impregnation or menstruation are going to trigger prolactin to be released. Not enough to where the woman would lactate, but enough to cause increase of breast swelling and some tenderness. Of course, blood levels of prolactin rise toward the end of pregnancy. So some women will actually start to lactate before the child is born. And then of course, suckling of the breast from a child is going to increase even more prolactin to be released into the blood, so that the woman can make more milk to feed the child. And once again, skipping over the homeostatic imbalances, but you do need to know them. All right, so the second half of this chapter, I actually already recorded this on Tuesday. And I recorded the first half on Tuesday, but I forgot to hit record. So I didn't record it. So you'll notice that in the second half, I have a scarf on. I might look a little different. My camera's at a different angle. So I do apologize about that. But I definitely wanted to get this up to you all sooner than later. So hopefully that's okay. But if you have any questions about the material, please do not hesitate to contact me. I will put up a video for chapter 17 talking about blood tomorrow, Thursday, so that you'll have both of these videos up to start studying and preparing for your upcoming quizzes and tests. And I'll upload these videos each week. My goal is to have them uploaded by Tuesday of each week so that you can watch them and use them to study. And please let me know if you find them helpful and if I can provide you any more explanation of the material. So I will hopefully see you in future videos.